Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Unscripted, the podcast available for SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes and any other podcast player of your choice, as well as a full video on YouTube for you to enjoy with full photography. In today's episode I'd like to talk about a criminally unloved example of high horology from a brand I would imagine is the most associated with luxury, Patek Philippe. However, the watch I'd like to address isn't exactly a piece you'd recognise like the Calatrava, Nautilus or any range of perpetual calendars or chronographs. Now, I've been rather unsure as to whether this piece should be a podcast, article or video, but being quite a discursive piece, I think that a podcast is the right choice, so let me know what you think in the comment section below. Before I begin, if you enjoy this piece, please remember to like, share and subscribe on YouTube and to follow us on your podcast player of choice to keep the content coming. But without any further ado, let's get straight into this unusual and perhaps important Patek Philippe which has been overlooked for rather a few years, via a rambling and, I hope, entertaining story from a couple of years ago. As has been the case for the best part of the last decade, the Patek Philippe Nautilus and, to a lesser extent, the Aquanaut drive ever-increasing prices as the desire for a luxury stainless steel sports watch continues to rise. More recently, the now confirmed discontinuation of the most iconic reference, 5711 Nautilus, has pushed prices up by about 50%, in only a couple of weeks to an average price which I can see around £90,000 a watch, a staggering increase over the list price. I have of course already addressed this corporate move in another podcast, and I do want to make very clear that I don't have some sort of fixation on the matter. But nevertheless, there does remain a watch to address, the grossly unloved Patek Philippe Neptune, the fallen brother in Patek Philippe's trio of sports watches, two of which we'd recognise far more easily. To set the mood for this watch, allow me to tell you a story. It's late 2019, if memory serves, and I've enjoyed a good meal with a watch industry friend and a cigar with another before him, but my evening isn't over yet, because my intention was then to walk to Bonhams for a pre-auction viewing of, I was assured, a very interesting range of watches. Passing through a crowd of the obvious suspects, a mix of the garishly suited and short-skirted in the foyer, I wind my way up a flight of stairs into a room populated by a very different demographic. The room, a large nondescript space with an arena of poorly lit and pretty overcrowded cabinets of watches in its centre, seems almost farcical. Spectacles balanced on the ends of noses seem to replace all of the ostentation downstairs as enthusiasts peer through finger-smeared vitrines and very carelessly labelled lots. Behind this rather amusing scene, an all-too-temporary bar seems to be installed to coax the inspiration to bid into attendees. None with whom I speak have any intention to do so, although I don't know what that says about the auction the next day. Nevertheless, it was an evening I enjoyed all the same with the company of friends and acquaintances from the watch industry and the enthusiast field. Yet that evening in London at this auction viewing, two things really sprang out for me. The first was the reference 1019 Rolex Milgauss, the first time I'd had the opportunity to handle one by the way, presented in immaculate condition with its brushed silver dial, applied markers and coffin hands, which should really have been a showstopper. I'm expecting its obvious practicality to overturn my prejudices about Rolex, of which I must admit there are a few, and my almost pig-headed refusal to add one to my collection when the opportunity arose. But no such sentiment grabbed me. I was aware of the obvious elegance of the watch and its importance to history, but sitting in my hand, I felt absolutely nothing for it. Something of a surprise, I must admit, but I was pleased to have had this experience to really inform my future interactions with Rolex pieces. But the more important point, the second point, was to do with another watch I handled, lot number 35. Now lot number 35 didn't really do itself justice in Bonhams' online picture, a photo rather poorly cropped from a shot next to a gold Rolex Daytona. Housed in a steel and gold case, this was an oddball by any standards, a Patek Philippe Neptune reference 5080/1 from 1999 with a replacement movement. At the time I regarded it as a pretty curious piece as it seemed a product of a Patek Philippe which had taken total leave of its senses. With a strange bezel with a hint of overblown Rolex Zephyr to it, a dial rather carelessly thrown together, and a case unable to decide if it wanted an integrated bracelet or to simply be a bulky Calatrava, suffice it to say that the Neptune was a profoundly odd piece. To be quite honest, as a watchmaking analogy for the event I witnessed at Bonhams, this Patek Philippe Neptune had outdone itself. But what actually is the story behind the Neptune, and why does it deserve to be told? Well, I must confess a certain bias given prevailing circumstances at present, and the recent ascent to popularity of the Nautilus and Aquanaut models. Would any other, and need I even say more handsome, nondescript Patek Philippe receive the luxury of such investigation? Well, probably not, but let's not dwell on why I'm giving it to a watch widely accepted to have neither horological merit nor looks aside from the appeal of its inarguable pedigree. Instead, let's look at the Neptune as a failed episode in Patek Philippe's history, as a brand which seems at times to release watches rather more at random than some other brands which may compete with it. The Neptune story begins in the mid-1990s with a desire for a new sports watch. Let's not forget that by this stage it has been almost 2 decades since the launch of the Nautilus, and quite honestly the world had moved on since then. Design had gained an often misguided desire for curved lines, and far removed from the relatively Spartan and elemental watches of the 70s, watches had rather a busy appearance. Patek Philippe launched 3 watches to fill the aforementioned void: the Aquanaut, the Calatrava Sculpture Russian watch as it's so often called, and the Neptune. Of course there's plenty known about the Aquanaut and its history, but the Sculpture or Russian watch as it's so often called due to the market it was intended to reintroduce the brand to, is far less well known. Curiously, it's the only one of these 3 which truly integrated the bracelet into the design, with even more curves and unusual shapes than on the Neptune. But in any case, the worldwide importance of this watch and its rather strange Fabergé egg crown is rather limited, as it was conceived only for the Russian market in a time when it's fairly safe to say that wealth was moving to new areas of society in that particular country. The Neptune, on the other hand, was genuinely available worldwide, and had it been popular, may have taken the Aquanaut's current place in the Patek Philippe collection. Perhaps inevitably, an assortment of 26mm women's versions with quartz movements and varying degrees of gem incrustation was available, yet it's the men's models which directed the collection, and so I'll pay more attention to these in this podcast. The simpler and more common references were 5080 and 5081. Of these, the majority were the 5080, which was the 3-hand variant with the date and a diameter of 36.5mm, thus making the piece just a bit smaller than an original Patek Philippe Nautilus mid-size, which was 37.5mm. Inside, this watch is powered by the well-known caliber 315/190 SC, with SC referring to Seconde Centrale or Central Seconds in English. This movement and its relatives are, I think it will be fair to say, the bread and butter of the Patek Philippe collection, and the perfect standard production 3-hand movement for the brand. Beside this model, available in steel or two-tone, was the reference 5081, which was identical in every way, except for coming with a fully solid gold case and bracelet. But why, though, is this an interesting watch? In short, this was the watch which stiffened Patek Philippe's resolve for the creation of the Aquanaut in 1997. You see, launched in 1995, the reference 5080 and 5081 spearheaded the idea of producing a sports watch in steel for the 1990s for Patek, and even provided the precedent for the movement in the Aquanaut. Clearly the tone set by its design was misguided, with that coffin-link bracelet and pretty ostentatious dial and bezel combination, yet it was in principle a successful experiment in my opinion. The more interesting model, however, is probably the reference 5085, released later in 1998 and produced until the mid-2000s. Remarkably far removed from the original Neptune, the reference 5085 appeared after the 1997 Patek Philippe Aquanaut, and thus benefited from its design refinements, let's say. Gone were those rather ostentatious ornate hands, dial and bezel, all smacking of a neoclassical 90s nightmare, and in their place you would find a simple, domed bezel and a refined radial dial, with white beton hands and modern Arabic numerals. The result to my eye is perfectly resolved, and just ideal for a forward-looking watch from that time period. In any case, aesthetics are intensely personal and ultimately shouldn't contribute to the greatness of any given watch due to this subjective nature. However, this was also a watch of horological merit, because nestled inside its 38mm case was the caliber 240/164, Patek Philippe's affordable complication movement, displaying the time, date, moon phase and power reserve on top of a very beautiful micro-rotor automatic movement. I must also add that the affordable complication point is very much within inverted commas, yet does still make sense in relation to the rest of the Patek collection. Most importantly, it was this watch which showed the suitability of such a complication for a sports watch, as when this watch was discontinued in 2005, Patek Philippe introduced the 3712, the same movement that presented in the Nautilus, and the following year, the modern reference 5712 took over the mantle and continues to be offered to the present day in the Nautilus collection. For me personally, though, it's neither the historical importance nor the undeniable aesthetic improvement presented by the reference 5085 which makes it great. Instead, I'd like to invite you to consider the ideal everyday Patek Philippe. In my opinion, it would be a watch with obvious, even overt elegance, yet no desire to be old-fashioned, but at the very most old school. This watch would offer a movement capable of accompanying one during daily life without any real impediment to convenience, but with the mechanical beauty to impress one when necessary. It would feature enough complications to remind you of the caliber of the watch, yet few enough to offer too many distractions, and nothing too superfluous. Finally, it will be a timepiece without the frailty to distract one from that daily life. Now picture this Neptune on its original bracelet if you're a purist, or on a leather strap if you, like I, would rather not witness the price of a bracelet repair, and are able to find an example without proprietary endpieces. Yes, they do exist. With subtle luminescence, understated water resistance, and no more than the suspicion of a crown guard mated to the elegance of a Calatrava, the Patek Philippe Neptune reference 5085 may just be the ideal watch. So what do you think? Is the Neptune representative of more than just a mid-90s experiment which failed to capture the imagination? Or do you think it's an important and underappreciated watch? Well, in the case of the example seen at Bonhams, that's to say the 5080, I must confess I remain unconvinced, even trying to convince myself. But if we're talking about the 5085, we might just be talking about a future auction star, just as soon as the collector's market becomes aware of it, and perhaps pays a little less attention to Nautilus and Aquanaut models in the Patek Philippe catalogue. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, and thank you very much for listening, because I'll conclude the podcast there. Of course, if you've enjoyed this, please do follow us on the podcast player you enjoy using, and subscribe on YouTube to always catch the latest videos, and of course head over to watchchronicler.com to read our full articles on a regular basis. But thank you very much for listening. This is Armon from watchchronicler.com. Out.